Hi, welcome back to the workshop. Today we're going to do a review of this, the Parkside PDM600 B2 wood lathe. I've never done any wood turning before, so this is going to be quite an interesting exercise for me. What we're going to do, first of all, I'll go through the bits and pieces you get out of the box, and we'll talk about the features of this lathe. We'll then talk about how it differs from a lathe you might buy, a more conventional lathe that you might pay a lot more money for. Then I'm going to basically spend 2 or 3 weeks, maybe 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, using the machine and trying to make things with the lathe. And then we'll come back and I'll give you my conclusions of what I think about this machine and whether I think it's worth buying or not. So join me in the workshop. Right, let's have a look at the bits that came out of the box. It comes pre-assembled, apart from this chisel guide, which is separate in the box. It has a headstock with the motor, the on-off switch and a speed control. It has a chisel guide assembly that moves up and down, and it has a tailstock which also moves up and down, and the whole thing is mounted on an extruded aluminium base. It comes with 2 spares just to help you loosen this headstock up and the tail pin. It comes with 2 chisels, and I'll let you know how I get on with those later in the video. And it also comes with a plate. What you do with the plate is you take this headstock pin off and basically you screw a piece of timber to this disc and mount it on there. It's really for bowls, making bowls and dishes and what have you. But again, later in the video, I'll tell you how I got on using that. And it comes with a book of words, which tells you most of what you want to know. It does have an exploded diagram in the instructions with all the parts numbered, but no actual parts list, which is a bit irritating. It does tell you one thing about this, which I'll explain again in a minute. So let's have a closer look, bit by bit. Just an interesting point before we go any further. I watched another video of a guy buying and reviewing his new lathe, and one of the things he did was to set the tailstock and the headstock pins against one another to see if they met up exactly here. Now I would have thought on any lathe that they should meet exactly, and so I was quite pleased to see that when I took this out of the box and simply laid it on a table and slid the tailstock up to the headstock pin, they meet exactly. And I've actually screwed this down to a bench as it should be, and with the same result. It meets exactly. I think that's pretty much a minimum requirement for a lathe. Let's first of all look at the headstock, which is the bit that powers the machine. It features a 550 watt motor, which is actually not that powerful if you think about it. I think most of my angle grinders are more powerful than that. The on-off switch is a push button, and the speed control is electronic. This is not belt driven. One of the things I was saying about the exploded diagram is if you study it, it tells you that this isn't belt driven, it's direct drive. And that does have implications when you're actually turning, because one of the big problems that you can face, especially someone like me, a novice, is that when you're turning and you offer the chisel up to the wood, you get what's called a check, which is basically when the chisel jams into the wood. Now with a belt driven machine, that belt acts as a clutch, but you don't have that on this. And I have seen comments on other videos talking about the machine smoking during use. And I do wonder whether it's because they're jamming up the two gears, which are either going to be metal, you know, something like aluminium, or plastic. And perhaps they're jamming up and getting hot. I don't know. I'll tell you how I get on with that later. As I say, the speed control is electronic, and it goes from 800 revs a minute up to 3,000 revs a minute. And if ever I get to use this at 3,000 revs a minute, I'll let you know. So that's the headstock. The next piece along the extrusion is the chisel guide, but essentially it moves up and down. You'd have a piece of wood fixed between the tailstock and the headstock, and you'd move the guide along to protect your chisels when you're working. It's pretty simple. It actually, when you turn it vertically, it locks onto the base, and at this stage I have to say it's pretty firm. Simply slacken it off and move it. And the same with this. It's got a screw fixing. And the final part of the machine is the tailstock. The tailstock slides up and down the base, and at its furthest point from between the two pins is 60 centimetres. So that's the biggest bit of wood, in theory, that you can use, that you can turn on this machine. It has a slightly curious way of tightening, and there's instructions on the top which are pretty simple. Essentially the key to it is to understand that this is simply a spanner on a spring-loaded head. So to release it one way or the other, you lift the whole of this spanner, and then if you want to tighten it up, you tighten, lift and drop it and tighten, and that locks the headstock in position. So it's got the a clamp bolt, I suppose you call it, running through the headstock, which gives you a fair amount of movement backwards and forwards, I would say a couple of inches. And there's a lock nut, which means that what you can do, you can put your piece of wood in the right location, and as you wind it in, so the pins at both ends are being forced into the wood to hold it in position, and then you would lock the nut in position to stop it coming loose, and I'm guessing use a spanner just to tighten it up a little bit. Now this is interesting, isn't it? I've got a bit of wood in position. Let's pull back, and bear in mind I've never done this. This is a first. I'm going to stand to one side and turn it on. Let's turn the speed down. And of course, what I didn't do was to take any pains to centre this on the two pins. Never mind, let's turn it on slow and see what happens. You can see this moving, can't you? I would hope to have that centred a bit better than that, but nonetheless it works. So that's the components of the lathe. I think it's important to say at this stage that this is very much an entry level machine. I think this costs 60 or 70 pounds. And at that price, the next size up you go to a lathe, the next is, you know, something like 250, 350 pounds. You pay a lot more. And I think you have to bear that in mind when you're making judgments on this. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to spend the next 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks using it and making things, trying to make things that are meaningful to me. and then we'll come back and we'll do a conclusion as to whether I think this is worth buying or not. Welcome back. As you saw from the short clips, I did quite a bit of practice on this machine over several weeks, and I made quite a few things. I did a lot of practice pieces like this, trying to use the chisels. That culminated in me making this, which I thought was really quite nice. And it was probably the first thing that I achieved where I thought, oh, I can do this. And I started to feel pleased with myself. But it still took quite a lot more practice with the chisels. And the first thing I made that was of any use was this mallet, a wooden mallet, which I've actually used. I was pleased. There was a lock failed on the door and I used it for chiseling out the plate, and it worked really well. It's made of holly wood, which is a hard, heavy wood, and it's really a pleasing thing to use. And then the last thing I made was this little goblet, and that's made out of a fence post, and I was really pleased with this. I'm quite proud of it. But in doing this, you do find out a few of the shortcomings of this particular machine. So let's go through those quickly before we talk about some of the pluses of the machine. First thing to say is that I used these to start with, the chisels that came with the machine, and I pretty quickly didn't like them. I disliked them quite a lot. They feel cheap and nasty, and I felt they were going to bend or break while I was using the machine. So I ended up buying a set of carbide chisels from Amazon like this, and I found those much better. And I enjoyed using those, and I had a lot more confidence in them because they're a hefty bit of steel. And everything I made that's of any use, I made with the carbide chisels. So that's the first thing. Chisels, not very good. The machine itself feels underpowered when you're using it. The motor itself at 550 watts is not terribly small. There are lots of lathes out there, small lathes that have smaller motors, but this is direct drive, and I think that means that it feels underpowered. And certainly if you're turning a lump of wood like this that has a rough finish and you've got to straighten it up, really felt it struggled. You had to speed the thing up to get any power out of the machine, and because of that it felt riskier. The whole thing felt more adventurous, shall we say. The chisel support feels flimsy and what have you, but it works okay, except that on occasions when you have a big lump of wood, an uneven bit of wood, the whole machine starts to vibrate and shake about, and the component parts of the chisel holder tend to come loose as well, which is a bit of a worry when you're working like that. The chisel support you adjust up and down and clamp into place. Well, it's only got about a 5mm bolt holding that, and it just feels a bit cheap. And I did find it clamped better if you lock it anti-clockwise on this big screw nut, etc. The tailstock worked okay. It was easy to use, bit basic, but it does work. Which brings me to two other things. The plate, making this goblet, I used a plate, simply screwing it on like that. And it does highlight a problem that most people use a bowl clamp, which fits on this end on the headstock. This is an M18 thread, and I don't think you can get a bowl clamp to fit this. And even if you could, would you really want to spend 150, 180 pounds on a clamp to fit on a 60-pound machine, 60, 70-pound machine? I'm not sure you would. I certainly wouldn't. So that limits the sort of work you can do, and also the size of the wood. I was turning with a bit of wood that was a 4x4 square. I started with that, and as I say, the whole thing was shaking about, which was a bit, which made me think that doing really big bits, doing a bowl to the full capacity of this, I think it's something like an 8-inch bowl, I think would be a bit of a struggle. Maybe one day I'll get round to using it. And the other disadvantages on this is tailstock pin, which isn't removable, and therefore you can't fit a drill chuck on it. A lot of jobs woodworking jobs require that you accurately drill using the tailstock into the piece of wood mounted on a plate or a bowl chuck, and you can't do that because you can't take this off, so you don't have that option. And that limits you for a lot of small jobs as well. Things like pen making. I don't think you could do pen making on this particular machine, and that's quite a big hobby thing, pen making. But apart from that, everything worked okay. The other thing I found was that my wrist, when I was working at this end, I would be adjusting the speed control with my wrist. So the downsides are it shakes about a bit underpowered, and limited options of the sort of work you can do. Okay, that's the downsides of it. The plus sides are that, first of all, I spent a lot of time learning how to use the chisels. And if you think about it, if you want to take up this hobby seriously, if you're really keen on it, how else do you learn to use the chisels without spending a lot of money on a better lathe? The only other way I can think of is if you can find a club or a friend who's got a lathe, and who'll let you spend hours on that lathe practicing, just to find out if it's the hobby you really want to go in for. But I did it on this, and I have made things, and I'm going to make other things. So I thought from that point of view it was a good machine, but, value for money wise. It was really good for that purpose. Learning whether you actually wanted to be a wood turner or not is probably the cheapest way to go. I enjoyed using it. That's the other thing. And so I made things, and not all of it, not very substantial things, but I enjoyed using it. It's a very absorbing hobby, very compelling. You really get into it. And once you have practiced with the chisels and become better, you get over that initial phase of getting lots of checks, which are quite scary, really seriously scary, And bear in mind that I've spent my whole life working with powerful power tools, hand tools. So you would think it wouldn't bother me, but it did. For the first probably couple of weeks of practice runs, I would come out quite shaky. But I think that would be the same on any lathe. So the plus sides are that it's low cost. It gives you a chance to learn whether you actually want to be a wood turner or not. Is it the hobby for you? And I think that's pretty good. So from that point of view, I think this is pretty good. At this stage, someone like me, if I wanted to be a wood turner and do a lot of it, I would be thinking about getting a bigger lathe. And I don't know how else you'd get to that point without actually spending the money first. So I hope this review helps you decide whether that's what you want to do, whether you want to be a wood turner or not, and whether you want to use this machine as the first step towards entering that craft, which I think is, I think it's a lovely craft, really, really compelling. I hope this helps you decide that, and if you did enjoy the video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you want to see more reviews or projects on stone crafting or what have you, please subscribe to the channel. So thank you for watching.